Typically, you would see me holding the Bible right now. But if you looked in the bulletin, you see that we're actually going to read Exodus chapter 7 through chapter 13. Now, I would love to keep you here until the picnic so we could all go together, but I don't think you really want to stay that long. And instead, I'm going to employ something you may have done in the past or may know of, and that is godly play. And you tell the story using visuals that will continue to come up again and again. So the reason that we're reading from chapter 7 to chapter 13 is that this is the story of the plagues, the well-known plague that we're still dealing with the gnats coming out. The plagues come about as God has asked repeatedly for Pharaoh to let God's people go, and Pharaoh won't let them go. And now God is going to do something that is a little bit challenging. I should take that back. It's very challenging to us. God is in complete control of this situation, and that is both wonderful and terrifying. But here's the sequence of how we'll tell these 9 plagues. We won't tell the last one until next week. Moses will go to Pharaoh. Moses will stand with Aaron and will look Pharaoh in the eye and say, "Let my people go." "Until now you have not listened," Moses will say to Pharaoh. "Now you will know that the Lord is the Lord." Then a plague will be unleashed. Pharaoh will scream and shout and say, "Please make it stop," and then the plague will stop. He'll say, "I will let your people go if you make this stop," and it stops, and then his heart will be hardened, and he will say, "They're not going anywhere." And then we'll get to the next plague. And it all actually begins at the river Nile. Moses and Pharaoh are standing by the river Nile, and he says, "That's the most beautiful river you've ever seen. It's what you use for agriculture, what you drink your water from. God's going to turn it into blood. And everything that is in it, the fish of the sea will die. And it's going to smell terrible." And it did. And the people screamed, and Pharaoh's own magicians didn't know how this was happening, and they said, "Make it stop. We need the Nile. We need it." And it stopped. And then Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he said, "I'm not letting your people go." Moses went back to Pharaoh and said, "Out of that river are going to come a whole bunch of frogs. And I don't know about you, Pharaoh, but frogs are pretty annoying. They're going to be hopping all over your lives, killing your crops." And Pharaoh says, "Make it stop. Make them go away." And so they go away, and then Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he says, "That was a nice try, but we survived blood in our river. We survived these frogs. We can survive anything." Well, God says, "Good luck. Here are some gnats." And the gnats are everywhere. The gnats are in your eyes, they're in your ears. Whenever you open your mouth, Pharaoh, they will be all over your people. People won't be able to go outside. And Pharaoh screams and shouts and says, "Get these out of here. Let your people leave." Moses commands the gnats to leave, and then Pharaoh's heart is hardened again by God. And Pharaoh says, "Nope, I was just kidding." Moses and Aaron go back to Pharaoh and say, "Well, if gnats were too small, I brought flies. And these flies are going to be everywhere. And flies are just as irritating, but bigger than gnats. And they're going to destroy crops. They're going to destroy lives." And Pharaoh finally screams and says, "Enough, get the flies away and I'll let your people go." And so Moses throws up his hand and it ceases. And then Pharaoh's heart is hardened and he says, "I was just kidding. I was just kidding." Moses and Aaron go back to Pharaoh and say, "Look at your livestock. They're so wonderful and necessary to everything you do. They will now be diseased, and they will die." And Pharaoh says, "Well, I still have the Israelites. I'm fine." But then the Israelites can't work. The people can't work. And finally, Pharaoh says, all right, enough. Make it stop. I'll let your people go. And it stops. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And Moses and Aaron left. Next, Moses and Aaron tell him about boils that need a lot of lotion. Boils that are all over their skin. They're itchy. They're irritating. You cannot sleep. You cannot work. Pharaoh finally says, get the people out of here. Get rid of these boils. Moses throws up his rod and the boils cease. They escape off of their arms. And he's about to lead the people out, and Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he says, no, I was just kidding. Then Moses says, look to the sky, and it will become thunder, and hail is going to destroy your crops. A side note, I didn't have an ability to make thunder and hail come down. So imagine hail coming down and destroying every one of their crops, and it is thundering and hailing nonstop for days. And finally Pharaoh says, enough, I'll let your people go if you'll just make this stop. And so he does, Moses. But then Pharaoh's heart is hardened and says, get them back to work. And so finally Moses goes back and he says, look, locusts are going to overcome everything. Anything that wasn't eaten before by the flies and the gnats, anything that doesn't smell terrible is now going to smell even worse as these locusts completely take over the entire kingdom of Egypt. Pharaoh says, enough, please make this stop. Moses holds up his staff and it ends. And Moses says, we will now leave. And Pharaoh says, no, my heart is hardened. You will stay and I will make you work even harder. Moses goes back to Pharaoh with Aaron one last time in the middle of the day about noon. And Moses says, let God's people go or else darkness will come all over the land. It will be dark all day long. It will cease to be able to see. Pharaoh doesn't think this is too bad. Darkness is not a terrible thing, but no candles will light. No crops will grow. No animals will know what to do. And so it is dark for 3 days. And finally, Pharaoh says, turn the lights back on, and I'll let your people go. Moses turns the lights back on. The sun comes back out. And Moses is about to lead the people out, but Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And Pharaoh says, no. No, you're not leaving. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I thought about these 10 plagues all week long as I prepared for this particular homily. And I thought about how it was amazing to tell this and to see these, but they feel so distant to me. I see a river, I see the Tara River, and then I think to myself, turning to blood, that's a big deal, but I don't really take stock of it. But then I start to think about all of them adding up. And I think to myself, that's a big deal. As I thought about it, I realized that there's a commonly used phrase in our household, that's too close. This is a well-worn phrase that fills the airs with varying degrees of love and sentiment. If you were to watch our family for a day, just be a silent observer, you could tell the time of day typically by the tone Lydia and I use when we utter, that's too close. The day begins with adorable faces whispering into our faces, is it time to go downstairs and wake up? That's too close, sweetie, is said through closed eyes while feeling the heat of a 4-year-old's breath. Later, when both children are vying for the finite space on our laps, the tone changes just a touch and is a little harsher and less welcoming. That's too close. The phrase has multiple uses, though. Not only does it remind our children of personal space, it also keeps them safe. Naturally curious, children tend to gravitate to the extremes in life. They love to gauge new objects, situations, and they want to see how they affect them. "Oh, that's too close," is shouted whenever the stove is lit to cook, or whenever we stand teetering on the sidewalk about to begin the process of crossing the street. The memorable times when I've uttered this overused phrase is whenever non-familial members are involved. Children, those curious beings that they are, lack the pretenses that we adults have, the societal proprieties we lean on over time and learn about, and they'll simply walk straight up to a dog, a cat, a non-domesticated animal, and especially older people and babies, and assume they are all props to be played with. They touch a baby's lips. They check to see if he or she has 10 fingers, whether or not her eyelids will close fast enough to stop the protruding finger, in addition to wondering if a wheelchair can go really fast downhill. Watch, Dad. These are all personal favorites of my children. And so the phrase is a reminder that not only do Mom and Dad appreciate personal space, but others do as well, sweethearts. The phrase will soon come in handy, some of you may know this, when we are inching or speeding closer and closer to the car in front of us as the girls learn the ways of driving. That is a little too close. What happens is we realize the phrase is really versatile. It is a lifesaver. It's a friendship saver. It is a gentle reminder to all of us to pay attention. How are you interacting with others? But you can't just tell people about this. You can't just tell your children, that's too close. Well, how close is too close, they'll ask. And so life takes experiences where we learn how to dance what I call the waltz of casual conversation, intimate dating, and honest discussions so that we might discern what is too close. I thought about this all week because God, it seems, does not share the same societal norms about what constitutes too close. God is eager, like a 4-year-old, to engage us, to nestle into our lives in the hopes of finding space whereby God can personally affect what's happening to us. God goes to great lengths to make God's self known, even to the point of hardening the heart of Pharaoh and unleashing 10 plagues of unquestionable majesty and power on the Egyptians. All week long, I looked on these plagues and I saw the visuals that are resting still here on this pulpit, and I want to say to God, that was a little too close. That's a little bit too intimate, God. How many of you, if you want to raise your hand and be bold, that's great. If not, you can raise it in your heart, in your life, have ever uttered the phrase, "Oh, that's not my God"? We do so more often than not, I find, when we read the Old Testament. In those moments, we wonder why or how God would do something like this. Why did God have to do it that way? Why couldn't God have done it without such a heavy hand? And then we thank God for sending Jesus Christ and the humble, gracious ministry that he lived, that he taught. I'm more of a New Testament kind of Christian, is something we say. It turns out it's not just with children or with other people that we say that's too close, but it's also with our God. Now the truth is, I know God had reasons for doing what God did to the Egyptians. And I know God is never going to explain that to me in this space and time. In fact, God doesn't have to explain this. God thought and did something God thought needed to happen. But that doesn't mean I don't wonder why. I become engrossed in the potential reasons God chose to unleash a torrent of vicious plagues that affected an entire civilization. Now, I can't figure out why God did what God did. But since God is my boss, I assume the need to lament God's actions. And I assume a posture of penitence on God's behalf. And I wonder, did God get a little too close for that situation? And so I'll say to people like you and to others on the street, oh, God does things like that sometimes. I'm not sure why. Or maybe I want to say, oh, God was just having a terrible day /week/month. And what I'm doing is distracting you. I'm trying to draw your attention away from this, and I want you to look at something totally different. Don't look at the plagues. Just think that sometimes God has rough weeks. And I don't say this, but I'm thinking it sometimes, oh, that's not my God. But it is. Because the God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament. It's the same God. And we must proclaim that. And that is something that we can and should take comfort in, even when it's really hard. Because the reality is God will never play by our rules. God will never succumb to our societal norms and desires for particularities about how people are to act and how they're to act in particular spaces. And that's a gift. That is a great gift that sets us free, that God wants to be in our lives so desperately that God will go to great lengths to announce God's presence. God doesn't know what "that's too close" means. I heard a podcast this week that reminded me of this. It's a podcast called Terrible. Thanks for asking. On it, the host, Nora, hosts conversations that we don't typically want to hear or think we need to hear. She is unbelievably raw and honest because life has been raw and honest with her. When her son was the tender age of 22 months old, her beloved husband died of brain cancer. Soon after that, her father succumbed to the disease as well. She was a widowed mother without a dad before she was 40. And so when people started asking her how she was doing, she said, "I'm terrible, but thanks for asking." And so she never hid from her emotions. She never shied away from her feelings of despair, nor her need to grapple with loss. She never let herself bury all that she was feeling or experiencing. In fact, she started to share it with anybody who would ask. And where I heard her was as a guest on Kate Bowler's podcast. This is the same Kate Bowler whose book we read last year for Lenten lectures, Everything Happens for a Reason. Their tearful, tender conversation made my eyes well up as I was walking down the street this week. They were an odd combination of both joyful tears, but also really sad tears as you hear their stories. The joy was in hearing honest conversation about the sadness that took great pain and great suffering for them to not only experience it, to reveal it too. The part, though, that struck my heart and gave me such joy was when they both encouraged each other, and by extension us, to never stop opening ourselves up. Never stop allowing a little more space for God to nestle into our lives. Because when we open ourselves up a bit, grace will come. Love will arrive. Hope will show up. It just doesn't always arrive in the pre-packaging that we want. It doesn't show up on our doorstep like the Amazon packages. But trust me, it does come. It may come in the form of 10 terrible plagues that ravage a civilization. It may come in the form of a people who were to be God's people, needing to see the power and majesty of their God before they're able to follow that God out of a country, out of a life they knew, into a promised land. It sometimes takes something so dramatic we say that's too close for us to trust the covenant that God continuously makes with us. The reality is we're apt to utter the phrase, "that's too close," because we want to keep a safe distance. I don't know about you, but I'm not eager to go into painful situations that will cause me suffering. I don't even like uncomfortable situations. We also utter this phrase because I think sometimes I want to keep my faith safe. There's difficulty in reading scriptures like today because it makes us wonder things about our God and our God's intentions. And in truth, it leaves me without answers. Why did God do this? And so I'm transported into an unknown arena whereby there are more questions than there are answers. And so if you're anything like me, you balk a bit And you might say, God, that one was a little too close. I'm going to keep my distance from that. I whispered that phrase when I was in Israel and Palestine earlier this year. We were to go to Hebron, which is where Abraham bought land and was to bury his descendants. It's a beautiful space in the country. You remember it in Genesis, he bought a little cave. He was going to marry Sarah and then his descendants, Isaac, Jacob, Jacob's 12 sons. We'd made our way into Hebron, and it is a small Israeli compound in the midst of Palestinian-controlled territories. There were more guns there than I've ever seen in my life. We were attempting to walk up to one of the most sacred and holy sites in both Judaism and Islam, and we had to go through 4 checkpoints. And I walked no further than this pulpit to those white doors. There were guns everywhere. There were 18-year-old conscripted Israelis who were standing there trying to keep the peace. And I thought to myself, this is too close. This is too close to a sacred space. This is too close for God. But then we left that space and went outside and met some of the nicest soldiers we ever met. And we met some of the nicest Palestinians we ever met. And we realized that sometimes things are way too close. But it's a matter of seeing it, of experiencing it. And I remember asking the soldiers and also the shop owners, how do you make it work? Because we want to be here. Because we want to worship our God. And we know we have to do this together. It's too much for us sometimes, but we want to be here. That's too close. I would love to tell you to get rid of that phrase because it's going to try to keep you at safe distances from experiences, from people, from going on trips, from trying new things, from reading particular scriptures, but you're not going to get rid of the phrase. I tried to this week. I was writing this literal homily saying to myself, I need to tell the people to not use this phrase. And in walked one of my adorable children who will remain nameless, who decided that dad needed help typing. And I said, that's too close, sweetie. It's simply difficult to get rid of the phrase. And so instead, I invite you to pay attention that when you say the phrase, that's too close, it means someone thinks you are so important, they want to be in your life. It may mean something totally different, but in that initial space, when someone gets that close to you, when God gets that close to you, it means you matter. Thanks be to God. Amen.